So like I said, my name's James. I'm an improvement manager. My background has kind of been the normal operational manager background. So I spent some time in medicine, surgery, but my kind of most enjoyable job was in acute and emergency care, and I was there for about 3 years. It kind of got to a point where I thought I can't manage another winter. Left acute and emergency medicine, went into surgery for a while, and thought actually this is not what I'm interested in. So for those of you that haven't seen the guide, this is a picture of it in front of you. So it's quite a nice and simple guide. There's a link at the bottom, but you can just Google NHSI patient flow guidance, and it will take you through to the section. You can download the PDF. And it's quite helpful to do that anyway. There are lots of other links going into other parts of the documents and other related documents. So one of the related documents is the case studies that support flow guidance. So what you can see is there's a case study from 10 different trusts up and down the country that do each of the sections really well. Now, this isn't to say they're the only areas. Actually, most areas will be doing one of the 10, if not more, really well. These were just a few that we pulled out where we think they're delivering some quite exceptional practice. Again, it's worth a read. What we always say with these things is don't necessarily worry too much about exactly what they've done or how they've done it. It's more about the principles underpinning what they've done and how they did it. And if you can move the principles, you'll do far better than trying to lift and shift the actual process. So, an introduction to the guides. What we say is, if you're working in urgent emergency care, share this document far and wide. The more people that see it, the better. It's quite practical. It's really quite simple. We found it goes down really well with the medics in particular because it was written in collaboration with most of the colleges and the societies that are relevant to urgent emergency care. So the RCP, the RCS, the College of Emergency Medicine, the Society of Acute Medicine, and so on. So although the document is new, the information that's in it isn't. So the good practice has been taken from a range of documents that have been around for a while. It's built quite heavily upon Keogh's Safer, Faster, Better that was produced a few years ago. But we've also taken the guidance from the Royal Colleges. We've taken some of the bits that NICE is saying, the specialist societies, and also factored in some of the recent publications from the Nuffield Trust and the King's Fund. So it's quite a comprehensive document and just kind of pulls it all together. The way we mainly use this document is in two areas. Firstly, it's about helping us to stimulate conversation on the current practice and potential opportunities with our clients. So we found it particularly helpful when trusts are saying to us, we don't have a CDU, for example. Should we have one? How do we make it? How do we make it work? We can use this as a tool to say, well, you don't necessarily need one, but if you do have one, these are the principles to work to. Where it can also be quite helpful is if a trust or an area are struggling and are not quite sure what to do or where to go, or maybe why they're struggling a little bit, we use this, and you can as well, just as a bit of a reference document to start asking the questions around, are they delivering best practice? Now, this is a guide. It isn't a you must do, because a lot of the best practice won't necessarily be applicable to every trust. A good example of that is primary care screening. So if you look at the patient demographics in Luton and Dunstable compared to the patient demographics in somewhere like Oughton, Norfolk, or in Cornwall or Devon, the patient group is very different. So although the principles remain the same, just a good way to start having that conversation with them. Okay, so in terms of where to go with the document, a lot of this stuff is very simple. What we always say is, if you really want to get the most out of it, and you really want to drive safety and quality in your urgent emergency care system, you should be implementing all 10 elements. If you do all the 10, what you will see is hospital crowding will reduce, emergency departments will decongest, and all of this stuff that everyone wants to happen. So mortality should fall, morbidity should fall, length of stay should go down, readmissions are questionable. That depends on the kind of the risk that the trusts are taking with things like discharge to assess. But it's the right thing to do. If you cherry pick certain elements, you'll be far less effective because a lot of what the guidance says will overlap into other projects in other areas. The guide has been written predominantly focusing on acute hospital care. There are elements such as the 10th element, admission, discharge and transfer, which is more aimed at the interface between the acute community and social care. But again, all of the principles and all of the guidance can be applied across the patch. So what you would find in the management of specialty or mental health can just as well be applied into community hospitals and indeed care and residential homes as it is in the acute hospital. I won't labour this slide much. I imagine that you're all well aware of it. What we've just looked at is we know that when it comes to flow, that patients waiting is not safe and it's not passive. So keeping a patient in bed, particularly a frail elderly patient, for a week or 2 weeks, that has negative implications for those patients. So what we know is that overcrowded emergency departments, they drive longer inpatient stays, mortality goes up. We know that the giving of antibiotics and other treatments are delayed. We know if we admit patients as outliers, they've got worse clinical outcomes, longer length of stay. But the most important thing for us, and this is kind of one of our key things that we talk to our systems about, is about how do we manage and how do we best manage the frail older population. So I've just presented some evidence here. If you go in Google Scholar, there are thousands of articles beyond this. But ultimately what it all comes down to is the longer we keep frail elderly patients in beds and in hospitals, they will decondition. They will lose a lot of muscle strength, and that can be the difference between going to a home or going back to their own home. We know that around half of patients who are 80 plus that are admitted will die within a year. So what we always say to people when we're talking about why should you change, why should you reflect on best practice, and why should there be a focus on delivering flow, particularly for the frail elderly, is because we truly believe that patients' time is the most important currency in health and social care. Money and it can pretty much buy you anything, but it can't buy you more time. So a question that we ask everyone, and we ask this all the time, is a way to pull people back to the real fundamental of why are we doing what we're doing. Everyone talks about what are we doing, everyone talks about how are we doing it and how are we doing, but very few people talk about the why. And ultimately, for clinicians and for us as management, the why is why we do what we do and it's why we came into the jobs we do. And that's the most important thing. So we will always ask people, if you had 1,000 days left to live, how many would you choose to spend in hospital? I've asked that question countless times now, and no one has ever said they would want to spend more than a day in hospital. But what we've done as a health system is we've created systems where we've normalised and we accept the treatment plan on a Friday afternoon of plan for this very elderly patient is to do bloods and review them on Monday. And we've normalised that to a degree, and we've accepted that over weekends, patients aren't going to get out of bed, nothing's going to happen. So what we really suggest when you're having these conversations is just to focus people firstly on why is flow important, and then get into the conversation around how are they doing, what's stopping flow in their systems. Probably teaching Franny to suck eggs a little bit here, but ultimately delivering flow all comes back to what we call is the ABC. So it's the attitude behaviours and the cultures which will underpin everything. If people believe they can or they believe they can't, they will be right. If they believe that the flow is just too difficult and maybe that flow doesn't create harm, that's what they will see. So there's a big bit of our work around how can we start shifting the dial around people's attitudes to unnecessary waiting? How can we start shifting their behaviours to be a bit more kind and a bit more compassionate, both to each other and to their patients? And if we can do that, that will start shifting the dial on their culture. So within the document, we talk about there being 6 principles of flow. Again, none of these are new, and most of us will probably write them down on the back of an envelope if you ask to in a few minutes. The 6 parts, though, are flow is a team sport. The NHS is evolved, and as people have become more and more specialised, we've become more and more isolated. But for a patient, as they go through the urgent emergency care pathway, whether that's as an outpatient, whether that's during an inpatient spell, or whether it's afterwards, they will touch many departments, many services and many providers. And so what we always say is when you start this process, get everyone in the room together, get people talking, get people to focus on what is the shared purpose and what is the shared vision. Do your social care colleagues believe the same things as your acute care colleagues, and are they all pulling towards the same goal? What's really important is that flow needs focus from the top. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be all of your board. Your board should be involved and they should be aware and they should be driving, but that can be the top of a department, it can be the top of a ward, it can even be the top of a bay. So is your band 5 nurse in a bay, are they really driving it and are they focusing on flow, and is that repeated throughout the organisation? Everyone would have heard of the Keogh 7-day standards, and that's the key part around what we know from an urgent emergency care point. Attendances, admissions, they're all pretty stable. You can pretty much draw a graph before you go anywhere and map out what's going to happen to their admissions and what's going to happen to their discharges. And there's almost always a disconnect at the weekends. So always ask the questions, how can you deliver flow 7 days a week? That doesn't necessarily mean to be having a consultant on every ward at the weekend. If consultants, clinical teams are setting good clinical criteria for discharge on a Friday afternoon, that will probably be good enough to improve flow over the weekend, and that will improve safety. We talk a bit about case mix, and that's really important to understand. Is what we've got, is it aligned to the demand? And that needs to be into the detail of what's going on with your elderly population. Are we providing the services they need at the times they need them? In most places, the answer at the moment is no, but it's a good place to start asking the question. The final 2 are really, really important. So we need to make sure that patients are more involved. When we talk about designing services, patients will have a different view, and patients will value things that we may not see or that we may not value. But what we found is easier. One of the most valuable things that patients or lay people can provide is they can ask the difficult questions or the stupid questions or the questions that everyone in the room is thinking but it's politically not sensible to say within our culture and within healthcare, and they can really help break down some of those barriers. The final point and the final principle around flow, this is probably one of the most difficult ones to deliver. But when things get to their absolute worst, they're the times when flow needs to be maintained. So what we'll often see is when trusts are under the greatest pressure, and they will fill up their ambulatory care areas, they'll fill up their CDU, they'll fill up every nook and cranny in the hospital just to get patients in and through the doors. Because that's deemed as safe. But what all that does, it bottles up an issue for elsewhere. We know that if you admit a patient as an outlier, you normally add about 3 days onto the length of stay. So whilst you're under pressure, as soon as you start admitting patients into the wrong areas, it's just bottling up an issue for later. you're probably getting a theme of this now. So through the guidance and what we say, it's about mindset. Comes back to your ABCs. A quite powerful question we find helpful is almost every health system we talk to about the patient flow guidance and about urgent emergency care, people initially say to us, we don't have enough beds. If we just had some more beds, it would all be all right. And that could be beds in ED or beds in AMU or inpatient wards or care home or residential home or community, wherever. The question we ask is, if you could get done everything you need to be done for a patient within an hour, would you need more beds? Again, the answer has never been yes. What that begins to show is it starts to challenge the thought process that capacity and flow is not about beds, it's about processes, and it's about availability of staff. Is staff doing the right thing, and are we able to provide what the patients need when the patients need them? If any of you have been an inpatient ever, I have on multiple occasions, you'll know that sleeping in a hospital is not easy. You'll be woken up to get your blood pressures done and your OBS done and pain relief and everything else. It's what we see. The longer we keep patients in beds unnecessarily, they'll decondition physically, but they'll also decondition mentally. Continuously broken sleep, particularly for our older patients, will not help their recovery. So keeping them in longer, trying to get back to baseline, which is a term that we say, if you hear it, just ban it. You're never going to reach it. You're just going to always be aiming for a goal that's not attainable. So a bit more specifically about the guidance itself. So the guidance is split into 10 different areas, which you can see on the screen at the moment. What you can see is that we've pulled out 3 areas: mental health, frailty, and admission, transfer, and discharge, which cover all other areas. Specialties are also a bit of an all-encompassing part of the system. And what we've then done is we've broken down the other parts into smaller areas, but there will be overflow and overlap from almost all of them. In each of the 10 areas, what you'll find, I've pulled out the CDU here as an example. Each of the sections are broken down into 3 elements. On the top is the outcome. So those of you that are familiar with the IHI's model for improvement, this is your aim. When you're talking about projects and when you're talking about if you were to create a CDU or a frailty system or a frailty pathway, this is quite a good starting place to say this is our why. This is what we're aiming for. This is why we want to do it. The guidance then talks about some principles, and again, these are all guidelines. We're not saying you must do it. Some won't be relevant. Some places will be doing things which are better than what we've suggested, and we may just not have heard about it yet. But we've tried to keep it simple. We've tried to use simple language, keep it quite short, so people can have a look and say, yes, all right, we do that, or we don't do that, and we should, or we don't do that, and actually we don't need to because of whatever reason. At the bottom of each section, there's a small bit on about how you can learn more. So in here, we've referenced what the individual societies and colleges were telling us. There's loads of good information there where if you're doing a certain project in a certain area, we'd recommend you to have a look. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, what we use and what we suggest our clients use is the model for improvement and PDSAs. This might look a little bit complicated, but it's really, really simple. What it's about is being really clear about the aim. What are you trying to achieve? And asking the question of how will you know that change is an improvement? Almost all of us will have been involved in projects at some point in the past where I've got an idea, you just start doing it, and then everyone says, this is really great, it's made things better. But no one can necessarily show it or see it. So we need to be really clear right at the start, what measures are we going to be tracking to see if we're making a difference? Finally, that brainstorming part of, well, we know what we want to achieve, we know how we're going to measure it, so what can we do to make a change? And then really simply do your PDSAs. From our experience, we keep this in our mind, but generally we don't talk about PDSAs because a lot of the shop floor clinicians don't understand what it means. they hear an acronym spoken from a manager's mouth, and it just turns them off. And they think, I'm not interested. But when you just talk about doing some really simple, really small tests to see if their ideas work, they kind of get that and they get on board. And politically, it's much easier to make a really small change than it is a big overarching change to a whole department. So that's it. That's all I was going to say. I hope you found that a reasonably helpful and interesting introduction to it.